Hello everyone and welcome to the first part of this course, the part on philosophy of science. Before I get started with that, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Michael Vlerik and I'm a philosopher of science. If you want to find more information about my research, my writings, you can find that on my website, and I'll also give you my email address attached. I'm Belgian, so if you're Dutch speaking, I do understand Dutch. And I've been teaching in Tilburg for the last 3 years and a half, almost 4 years, and this is the third time I'm teaching this course, which I am very passionate about because it's very close to my research interests and my interests in general. So what are we going to talk about in the next 7 lectures? Well, the course is, as I said, about philosophy of science. And that brings me to this very important first question: what is philosophy of science? And that is the question we'll cover in this brief introduction in this clip. So what is philosophy of science? Well, philosophy of science is concerned with a central question, and that question is, what is science? Now, this may seem a pretty easy question to answer, or at least a question with a pretty straightforward answer. You might say, well, science is biology, is physics, is chemistry, and it's not art, mythology, or religion. And of course, you would be right, but the question we're asking here is, what actually makes science science? What do all sciences have in common? And again, you might answer, well, science tries to explain certain domains of the world, certain phenomena in these domains of reality, if you will, and tries to predict phenomena. And you would be right again, but still that wouldn't be the whole answer, because if you look, for instance, at astronomy, a legitimate science, and astrology, well, the horoscopes and everything, well, you see that both are actually explaining certain phenomena. The first one explains the movement of planets and stars, and the second one explains, your behavior, your future, even predicts your future, your character traits, and so forth. And we want to say that the first one is a legitimate science, astronomy, and the second one not so much. The second one is what we call a pseudoscience. It may look like science in certain kind of respects, but it doesn't really reserve the quality label we accord to science. So that is also a central question we'll be asking ourselves. Now, what is the difference between science and pseudoscience, between good, legitimate sciences and things that do not really deserve this, warrant of quality? And that central question, well, that central question, what is science, branches out to a number of related questions. First of all, philosophers of science will ask what the relationship is between scientific theories and the world. According to realists, well, scientific theories, at least our good or best scientific theories in our most developed fields, well, they objectively and accurately describe the world they're out to explain. According to anti-realists or instrumentalists, we can never make this strong truth claim. All we can say is that our good sciences or best sciences are very efficient in making accurate predictions about the world, but we can never say anything about the connection between the theory and the world itself. And so this kind of translates to a different kind of goal for science. For realists, that goal of science will be truth, while for instrumentalists, anti-realists, it will be merely accurate predictions, for instance. And there's also a number of other questions. One in particular has taken up a lot of attention by philosophers of science, and that is the question how sciences develop over time. According to Karl Popper, somebody we'll talk about later in the course as well, the man you see on your left, well, according to Karl Popper, the development of science over the last centuries is a gradual process. in which parts of the theory are being replaced by new hypotheses which are better able to explain the world. And this kind of gradual process gets us closer and closer to the truth, to the actual objective description of how the world works according to Popper, or at least we can assume it does, and we have reason to believe it does. So Popper is a realist. Somebody like Kuhn, the man with the glasses on your right, says something very differently. According to him, science develops with revolutionary periods in which everything that came before is being discarded and we start anew with a new kind of perspective on the world. And he is a strong anti-realist, a strong instrumentalist. He would go as far as saying that we have no reason to assume that our newest theories are fundamentally more accurate, more truthful than our older theories. It's just a new perspective of looking at the world. Personally, I do not side with the anti-realists, but I just want to give you a feel for the kind of discussions philosophers of science have about science. Now, you may say or ask, well, what is the use of all this abstract, high-level theorizing about science? What is the use for scientists and the actual sciences themselves? And you'd be right to question the value of this. But philosophers of science, they do much more than just come with these high-level abstract theories about science in general. They are also concerned with particular sciences and particular issues within these sciences. So there are philosophers of physics, philosophers of biology, and philosophers of economics, and they are, as I said, they're concerned with issues in that very science. So for instance, in the philosophy of economics, philosophers and scientists have been asking, well, are economic theories, are they objective in any real sense? Are they free of all kinds of values that would distort our view of whatever happens in the economic realm? And according to many philosophers, in the human sciences in general, and so also in economics, a value-free science is just an ideal that we can never reach because if only because we already have certain kind of interests. We want to measure certain kind of variables which seem more relevant, seem more important to us than other kind of variables. So we're making kind of a choice here, and the way we set up our science, the things we want to measure within our science, we want to theorize about, we want to create models about, already betrays a very value-laden view of the world. Certain things we think are valuable to know, other things we simply discard. Even more importantly, I think philosophers of science, they will question some of the core and the central assumptions made in the various sciences. So also in economics, over the last decades, the assumption that economic actors, be it consumers or investors, are purely rational people, homo economicus as they often refer to that idea, has come under increasing criticism. Interesting research in behavioral economics, which is actually more psychology than economics, but some kind of interdisciplinary approach, and we'll talk some more about that in the coming lectures and in the tutorial, show that not only do consumers, investors, do economic actors not behave as rationally as we'd like to assume, but even their irrationality is in some kind of way systematic. They are predictably irrational, and that has important consequences for society. Because in contrast to, for instance, physics or astrophysics, our theories in the human sciences, and especially in economics, have a profound effect on society. Because those theories, they will inform economic policy, so they will shape society to a certain kind of extent. And according to many thinkers, part of the reason for the financial crisis in 2008 till 2010, 2011 was caused by some kind of crisis in the economic sciences. More particularly, they argued that many of those models that were being put in place to estimate the risk of certain financial assets and certain financial products were completely wrong-headed. And so this led bankers to, purchase these products and turn a blind eye to the important risks that were inherent to the whole system. So the financial crisis being at least in part brought about by mistaken models, theories in the science of economics. And so that is the huge importance of a critical view on these assumptions and these models. And that is where philosophers of science, philosophers of economics, and scientists, economists work together. And that brings me to the general question what philosophy is and what the use of philosophy is, what its added value is. Now, when you talk to people and you ask them, what is philosophy? You often get an answer, well, what philosophers do is formulating some obscure sounding theories from a kind of ivory tower, or they have poetical musings about the meaning of life. And truth be told, many philosophers have engaged in these kind of practices, but it is not, I believe, the essence of what philosophy is, or at least not what it should be. What philosophy is in the first place a way of thinking. It's a rational way of thinking that is radically critical and that adopts a broad perspective. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, a rational way of thinking. Philosophy was born or was developed some 2,500 years ago in the ancient Greek civilization, but actually in places that now belong to modern Turkey. And it was born when some thinkers, for the first time in human history, did not rely on religious stories, mythological stories to explain their world, but actually try to understand and explain their worlds by perceiving the world, so by sense perception and by logical, rational thinking about what they were perceiving. And that is the birth of philosophy, and that is the essence of philosophy. It is a rational way of thinking. And it is also the skill that I would like to teach you in the coming lectures. Secondly, it is radically critical. And in this sense, it kind of differs from science. Rational approaches to the world are, as you obviously know, are inherent to a scientific view of the world as well. And this is no coincidence because science, was born out of philosophy in the 17th, 18th century. The modern sciences emerged from philosophy. The founding father of modern science and of modern physics was Isaac Newton, and he considered himself to be a philosopher of nature. Similarly, in economics, the founding father of economics, Adam Smith, was also a philosopher. So science was born out of philosophy, out of this rational way of thinking. But where science nowadays differs from philosophy and philosophy of science is that philosophy adopts a radically critical perspective. Now, science is also very critical, and we'll talk about scientific methodology and so forth later on in the course, and we'll see that scientists, or at least good scientists, will always try to empirically test their hypotheses and not just accept any hypothesis without rigorous testing. So it's very critical as well, but it's not radically critical, in the sense that it will not question its own basic founding assumptions. For instance, a physicist will not question the ability to use mathematics in order to understand the physical world. He will or she will just assume this to be a perfectly well-suited tool. Philosophers of science will question even these founding assumptions, the fundamentals of these different science, and in that sense they are radically critical, radical coming from the Latin word radix, which means root. So they question the roots of any kind of theory. And then finally, philosophy, and it differs in science in this respect as well, adopts a broad perspective. Whereas science has, or the sciences have, a very delimited kind of domain, they apply their thinking to. For instance, economics is concerned with the distribution of scarce goods in a society. Well, philosophy is able to look over the boundaries of different sciences and therefore adopt a more broad perspective on certain kind of issues. For instance, in my own research, I often use insights from economics, but also the social sciences, also psychology, anthropology, to think about certain kind of societal issues. And this is precisely where the use of philosophy lies. Its use for science is in the fact that with its critical approach and with this kind of broad perspective, it is on the one hand able to elucidate many concepts that are being used in that science. It is perfectly suited to question certain kind of assumptions that are made by scientists and which do not always hold up to a critical kind of scrutiny. And again, many scientists do this as well, but when they are doing this, they are kind of doing philosophy of science. And then finally, philosophy of science is wonderfully well suited to cross scientific boundaries, to kind of adopt a multidisciplinary perspective and to frame certain kind of questions in this new kind of broad perspective. But philosophy of science is also very much concerned with the process, more than the ready-made products. Now, when you have a scientific education, lots of the attention is on the theories themselves. We learn in high school about Newton's physics, perhaps even Einstein's. We learn about Darwin's evolutionary theory. And this is, of course, very important because these are our best theories about the world, and we should know these theories. But all too often, we don't hear anything about how those theories came to be, how they were developed. And in philosophy of science, we'll have a lot of attention for the process. So we won't focus as much on the theories themselves, but we'll focus on the way these theories got to be. Not so much on what is actually presented to us on a plate, but what happened in the kitchen beforehand. And this, I believe, is incredibly important for any aspiring scientists and for you as aspiring economists and perhaps statisticians to know how all of these theories, all of these scientific products are being developed, have been developed, and what kind of thinking actually science consists of. And the way we'll approach this first part of the course is precisely by focusing on thinking. Now, a typical course in philosophy of science, gives you a kind of historical overview of the last 100, 150 years, where you get a number of philosophers, and we've already seen Popper and Kuhn, those are two major ones, but a bunch of philosophers and what they have to say about science. Now, this is interesting, but this remains pretty high level and abstract. The way I want to approach this course on philosophy of science is by first starting to focus on our thinking, on human thinking, and where that thinking can predictably go wrong. So we'll adopt the perspective of critical thinking. First of all, we'll see what kind of systematic reasoning errors all humans are prone to make. We'll also ask why we make these reasoning errors, and we'll look at the consequences of these reasoning errors to then learn techniques, if you will, to improve our own thinking and to guard ourselves against all of these reasoning errors. And then finally, with this whole baggage of critical thinking, we'll reflect back on science and we'll address the question how the scientific context and the scientific methods protect against these reasoning errors. So we'll look at the way science works and how that makes science more reliable than, let's say, other forms of thinking and of describing the world. So concretely, how is part one of this course structured? Well, as you know from the course guide, we'll adopt a blended format. So that means recorded lectures and live Q&A sessions, also a live tutorial. So in the next lecture, you'll get an overview of our common reasoning errors. This, I hope, will be an entertaining lecture in which you'll get all kinds of examples and riddles of how our thinking goes wrong. And I really invite you to actually try to come up with your own intuitive answers and experience for yourself how our reasoning can be predictably irrational. After that, in the week after that, we'll have our tutorials. So in smaller groups, we'll work on these biases. I'll give you a bunch of cases and I'll ask you to detect the biases in these cases. After that, in lecture 3, we'll think about why we make these reasoning errors, what the evolutionary origin is of irrationality, and then we'll look at those domains of irrationality, what these reasoning errors can lead to, that is, irrationality in action. With that knowledge, we'll think about how we can actually improve our thinking, how we can protect our thinking against irrationality, and then in the penultimate lecture, we'll think about why all of this is important. We'll look into the importance of critical thinking or rationality. And finally, we'll reconnect all of that knowledge back to reflection on science. We'll think about a scientific method and we'll think about the demarcation criterion, which is the criterion to distinguish science from non-science or pseudoscience. Now, how will this course be assessed? Well, in part 1, we'll have an exam that will be the midterm exam, and there's also a written assignment. More information about the exam and obviously the assignment you will get in due time. Now, for the course in its entirety, part 1 and part 2 are equally weighed. You need a 6 to pass the course, that is a rounded 6, and you need an unrounded 5 for at least each part of the course. Now, all of this information is in the course guide, but I think it's useful to repeat it here. An important note for repeaters, for those who took the course last year, well, if you passed either part 1 or part 2 last year, you can carry over your mark for that part. You cannot carry over marks from previous years, but so from last year, you can carry over your mark for that part. If you want to do so, please do send me an email before the end of September, and then I'll make sure that your grade is carried over. And a final note on the course materials we work with in part 1 of this course. Now, all of the material is available on Canvas. The required readings are posted on Canvas. The links to recordings of lectures, PowerPoints of lectures and tutorial, all of that is on Canvas. What you'll also find on the Canvas page is a link to the textbook we work with and a PDF of the textbook. Now, the textbook is free, it's open access, but if you want a hard copy, you can order that to the link. I think that costs some 15 euros. But so the content in PDF and electronic copy is free. And as you'll see in the textbook, each chapter will correspond to a lecture, and it is very comprehensive. All of the information is in the textbook. All right, so that's it for today. If you have other practical questions and questions on the content of the course, well, we'll have many live moments on campus, so you can always ask me whatever would not be clear. Take care and see you very soon, I hope.